This is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. It is always fascinating to see how far these stories can reach. The Arkansas Ozarks have always been a place where people mind their own business. Dense forests, winding dirt roads, and hollers so deep that sunlight barely touches the ground create a landscape where secrets can remain buried for generations. In the autumn of 1953, in a remote valley near the Buffalo National River, one such secret began to emerge from the shadows of what had been considered a simple case of a man who just up and left. Herschel Grimm had lived in the same weathered cabin on Possum Creek Road for 37 years. To his neighbors scattered across the valley, he was the kind of man you could depend on. When old Mrs. Cordelia Vance needed firewood split, Herschel would appear at her door with his axe, before she even had to ask. When young Jasper Holcomb's mule went lame during harvest season, it was Herschel who showed up with his own team to help bring in the tobacco. He never asked for payment, never expected recognition. That was just Herschel's way. The last confirmed sighting of him was on October 13, 1953, when he purchased supplies at Wickham's General Store in Ponca. Store owner Rutherford Wickham later told investigators that Herschel seemed his usual self, quiet but polite, buying the same items he always did: salt pork, flour, coffee, kerosene, and ammunition for his .22 rifle. Nothing unusual in his manner or conversation. He mentioned the weather, commented that winter was coming early, and left with his goods loaded in his pickup truck. 3 days later, when Herschel failed to appear at the monthly church social at Buffalo River Baptist, folks began to take notice. Herschel never missed church social. In a community where the gathering served as both spiritual fellowship and vital communication network, his absence was as conspicuous as a missing stone in a carefully built wall. Preacher Nehemiah Crowley made inquiries, but no one had seen hide nor hair of Herschel since his trip to Wickham's. The first attempt to check on him came on October 18th. Cordelia Vance, concerned that she hadn't seen smoke from his chimney in several days, asked her nephew Basil to ride over to Herschel's place. What Basil found would puzzle investigators for decades to come. The cabin appeared exactly as it always had. Herschel's pickup truck sat in its usual spot beside the woodshed. The front door was closed but unlocked, which wasn't unusual in that part of the country where locks were more suggestion than necessity. Inside, everything was meticulously organized. Dishes cleaned and put away, bed made with military precision, clothes folded neatly in the chest of drawers. Even the coffee pot was cleaned and sitting ready for the next morning's brew. But Herschel was nowhere to be found. The only things missing were his rifle and the leather hunting jacket he wore during cold weather. This led most folks to assume he'd gone hunting and met with some accident in the vast wilderness that surrounded Possum Creek Road. The Arkansas Ozarks could swallow a man whole between steep bluffs, hidden sinkholes, and caves that went deeper into the earth than anyone had ever mapped. Newton County Sheriff Vernon Pickens organized search parties that combed the hills for 2 weeks. They found deer sign, bear tracks, old moonshine stills, and abandoned homesteads from families that had given up and moved to the cities. What they didn't find was any trace of Herschel Grimm or his rifle. It was as if he had simply evaporated into the October mist that clung to the valley walls each morning. The official report, filed on November 3, 1953, listed Herschel as a missing person, presumed dead due to hunting accident. Case closed, file archived, community moved on. But in a place where stories grow like kudzu, covering everything with persistent green tendrils, the disappearance of Herschel Grimm became something more complex than a simple hunting mishap. Herschel had come to the valley in 1916, a young man seeking isolation after returning from the Great War. Those who remembered his early days described him as haunted, in the way that many veterans were, but also possessing an almost supernatural ability to live off the land. He could track a wounded deer through terrain that would confuse experienced hunters. He knew which wild plants were edible and which were poison. Most remarkably, he seemed to have an uncanny sense for weather, predicting storms days before they arrived. His cabin was a testament to self-reliance and careful planning. Built from local oak and chestnut logs, it featured double-thick walls that kept the interior comfortable even during the bitter Ozark winters. The root cellar stayed cold year-round, preserving food without the need for ice. A well-designed fireplace drew perfectly and never smoked. Neighbors often commented that Herschel's place was the most efficiently constructed homestead in the valley, but efficiency wasn't what made Herschel's cabin memorable to those who visited. It was the silence that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. Not just the absence of sound, but something heavier, more present. Cordelia Vance once described it to her sister as the kind of quiet that makes you want to whisper, even when there's no reason to keep your voice down. Visitors often found themselves speaking in subdued tones without quite understanding why. The cabin's interior reflected its owner's meticulous nature. Books lined one wall, mostly technical manuals about agriculture, veterinary medicine, and engineering. A small collection of tools hung on wooden pegs, each one cleaned and sharpened to perfection. The few personal items visible included a framed photograph of a young woman and a military service medal that Herschel never spoke about, but never hid. What most visitors didn't know was that beneath the main floor, Herschel had constructed an unusually large basement. Accessed through a concealed door behind the kitchen pantry, the basement was more extensive than the foundation of the cabin would suggest. Locals who helped with the original construction in 1916 recalled Herschel insisting on excavating far deeper than necessary and reinforcing the walls with stones hauled from the river bottom. The stated purpose was food storage and workshop space, but the basement's design suggested something more complex. Multiple chambers branched off from the main room, each sealed with heavy wooden doors. The air circulation system was sophisticated for a rural homestead, featuring hidden vents that somehow kept the space dry despite the region's humid climate. Most curious was the workshop area, equipped with tools and equipment that seemed excessive for simple farm maintenance. Herschel's daily routine was as predictable as sunrise. He rose before dawn, tended to his small garden and livestock, spent several hours in the workshop basement, then dedicated the afternoon to helping neighbors or hunting for meat. Evenings were reserved for reading by the fireplace or sitting on the front porch, smoking his pipe and watching the stars emerge over the valley. This routine varied only during the coldest months of winter, when he might not emerge from the cabin for days at a time. Neighbors respected his privacy but noted certain peculiarities. Deliveries were always left at the end of his driveway, never brought to the door. He never invited anyone inside the cabin, preferring to conduct conversations on the porch or in the yard. When helping with community projects, he arrived exactly when needed and left immediately upon completion, friendly but never familiar, helpful but never intimate. The relationship that came closest to friendship was with Cordelia Vance, the widow who lived 2 miles down Possum Creek Road. Their properties shared a boundary line marked by an old stone fence, and over the years they had developed a system of mutual assistance. Cordelia would preserve extra vegetables from her garden for Herschel. During winter months, he would repair her equipment and split firewood. Their conversations were practical, but warm, touching on weather, crops, and valley gossip without ever becoming personal. It was Cordelia who first noticed the changes in Herschel's behavior during the weeks before his disappearance. In September 1953, he began appearing at her fence line at odd hours, sometimes before sunrise or well after sunset. He would stand among the trees, perfectly still, as if listening for something she couldn't hear. When she called out to him, he would acknowledge her with a wave but offer no explanation for his presence. His evening routine on the porch also changed. Instead of sitting in his usual chair facing the valley, he repositioned himself to watch the tree line behind the cabin. Cordelia observed this through her kitchen window while preparing supper, noting that he seemed to be tracking something moving through the forest. When she asked about it, he mentioned increased bear activity, but seemed troubled in a way that went beyond concern about wildlife. The changes were subtle enough that anyone less observant might have missed them entirely. His garden work became hurried, almost frantic. He spent longer hours in the basement workshop, sometimes not emerging until well after dark. The sound of tools working carried across the valley at unusual hours, creating a metallic rhythm that replaced the evening chorus of insects and birds. Smoke from his chimney took on a different character, thicker and with an acrid smell that wasn't entirely wood. On October 10th, 3 days before his last trip to Wickham's store, Cordelia witnessed an incident that she later described as the moment I knew something was deeply wrong. She was hanging laundry on her line when she heard the sound of Herschel's voice coming from his property. Not unusual in itself, except that he appeared to be having a lengthy conversation. Curious about this unexpected visitor, she positioned herself where she could observe his cabin through the trees. Herschel stood in his front yard, speaking earnestly to someone Cordelia couldn't see. His body language suggested he was addressing a person of authority, perhaps a government official or law enforcement officer. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Herschel occasionally gesturing toward the cabin and shaking his head as if refusing something. What disturbed Cordelia was that despite her clear view of the yard and surrounding area, she never saw the person he was speaking to. No vehicle was parked nearby. No figure emerged from behind the cabin or from the tree line. When the conversation ended, Herschel returned to the cabin and remained inside for the rest of the day. No smoke came from the chimney despite the cold weather. No lights appeared in the windows after sunset. The property seemed abandoned, yet his truck remained in its usual place. The next morning, normal activity resumed, as if nothing had happened. Herschel worked in his garden, visited the workshop, prepared for his weekly trip to town. But Cordelia noticed that he moved with the deliberate efficiency of someone completing necessary tasks before a departure. He harvested the remaining vegetables, secured equipment that would normally be left outdoors, and cleaned the cabin with unusual thoroughness. Cordelia's testimony about the invisible conversation was discounted by investigators as the mistaken perceptions of an elderly woman. Sheriff Pickens suggested she had observed Herschel talking to himself, a common enough behavior among people who lived in isolation. But Cordelia insisted the conversation had two distinct voices, even though she couldn't make out words at such a distance. She also noted that Herschel's responses came at intervals that suggested he was listening to lengthy statements or questions from someone else. This testimony gained credibility years later when investigators discovered that several other Valley residents had noticed unusual activity around Herschel's property during early October 1953. Jasper Holcomb reported seeing lights moving through the forest behind the cabin on multiple nights, lights that followed no logical path and disappeared when he tried to get a closer look. Rutherford Wickham mentioned that during Herschel's final visit to the store, he had asked unusual questions about bus schedules to Memphis and whether the store received mail deliveries from federal agencies. Most intriguing was a report from preacher Nehemiah Crowley, who had attempted to visit Herschel on October 12th to discuss arrangements for the monthly church social. Crowley found Herschel seated on his front porch in the middle of the day, staring at a piece of paper he quickly folded and put away when the preacher arrived. Their conversation was brief and uncomfortable, with Herschel declining to commit to attending the social and showing none of his usual hospitality. As Crowley prepared to leave, he heard a sound from inside the cabin that he described as machinery running, like some kind of motor or engine, but quieter than any farm equipment I knew. When asked why he hadn't mentioned this earlier, Crowley explained that he had assumed Herschel was working on a project with borrowed equipment. Only after the disappearance did the sound seem significant, because no such equipment was found when the cabin was searched. The search of Herschel's property was conducted by Sheriff Pickens and 3 deputies, accompanied by several community volunteers. They examined every room, opened every drawer and container, checked the root cellar and outbuildings. The search was thorough but not technically sophisticated, reflecting the investigative capabilities of a rural sheriff's department in 1953. No evidence of violence or struggle was found. Personal papers were in order, money was still in the coffee tin where Herschel kept his savings, and valuable items remained untouched. The basement workshop received particular attention because of its size and unusual layout. Deputies found a well-equipped woodworking shop, tools for metalworking, and supplies for various craft projects. Several partially completed items suggested Herschel had been working on furniture and farm implements for neighbors. Nothing seemed unusual or suspicious, though the sophistication of the equipment impressed the investigators. What they failed to discover was a concealed room behind the workshop's back wall. The entrance was so skillfully hidden that it would require detailed architectural knowledge to detect. This discovery would wait until 1967, when the property underwent a more thorough investigation under very different circumstances. In November 1953, as winter settled over the valley, Herschel's cabin was secured, and his property became the responsibility of Newton County. No relatives came forward to claim the estate. Legal notices were published in regional newspapers without response. After the required waiting period, the property was scheduled for auction to settle any outstanding debts and transfer ownership to the county for eventual sale. But the auction never took place. In March 1954, just as legal proceedings were concluding, a letter arrived at the Newton County Courthouse. Postmarked from Memphis with no return address, it contained a single sheet of paper with a typewritten message. Herschel Grimm Estate should not be disturbed. Property contains materials hazardous to public health. Recommend permanent quarantine. The letter was signed with an illegible signature and bore what appeared to be an official government seal, though no one could identify which agency it represented. County officials were puzzled by this unexpected communication. No government agency had previously expressed interest in the property. No environmental hazards had been identified during the searches. Sheriff Pickens contacted state authorities and federal agencies, but could find no one willing to take responsibility for the letter or explain its purpose. Faced with potential liability issues and unwilling to risk public health, the county commissioners decided to postpone the auction pending further investigation. The cabin was secured with better locks, warning signs were posted, and access to the property was restricted to authorized personnel only. Months passed without additional information or clarification. The letter writer never provided additional details or follow-up communication. Government agencies contacted by the county claimed no knowledge of the matter and showed no interest in pursuing it further. Herschel's property settled into a strange legal limbo, neither abandoned nor actively investigated. Local residents respected the quarantine but developed their own theories about its purpose. Some suspected moonshine production, others worried about chemical contamination from unknown sources. A few whispered about government secrets or classified military projects. The isolation that had made Herschel's property attractive for privacy now made it perfect for speculation and rumors. Years passed without resolution. The cabin weathered multiple harsh winters, its roof and walls gradually showing signs of neglect despite the solid construction. Wildlife reclaimed the garden, and the access road became overgrown with brush. The property transformed from a well-maintained homestead into another abandoned ruin scattered throughout the Arkansas Ozarks. Valley residents occasionally reported seeing lights or movement around the old cabin, but these sightings were attributed to hunters, curiosity seekers or teenagers looking for adventure. Sheriff Pickens retired in 1959, and his successor showed little interest in old mysteries. The file on Herschel Grimm's disappearance was transferred to the archives, where it gathered dust alongside dozens of other unsolved cases from the region's history. The first break in the case came in 1962, not through official investigation, but through academic research. Dr. Magnus Redfield, a historian from the University of Arkansas, was conducting a study of rural communities in the Ozarks for his book on settlement patterns and social structures. His research included interviews with elderly residents about family histories and community changes over time. During an interview with Cordelia Vance, then in her 80s but still mentally sharp, Dr. Redfield learned about the mysterious disappearance and the subsequent government intervention. Intrigued by the unusual circumstances, he requested access to official records and discovered the incomplete investigation and unresolved legal status of the property. Dr. Redfield's academic credentials and university backing gave him access to resources unavailable to local authorities in 1953. He contacted federal agencies through university channels, submitted Freedom of Information Act requests, and consulted with colleagues who had experience with government classification procedures. His inquiries revealed a pattern of bureaucratic confusion and misdirection that suggested deliberate concealment rather than simple administrative error. The break came when Dr. Redfield's FOIA request reached an archivist at the National Archives who recognized the case details. A brief notation in classified military records indicated that Herschel Grimm had been involved in a classified engineering project during World War I, years before he arrived in Arkansas. The project details were still classified, but the notation suggested ongoing government interest in Grimm's activities and whereabouts. This discovery led Dr. Redfield to examine military records more carefully. He found that Herschel had served not just as an ordinary soldier, but as part of a special engineering unit responsible for developing what the records described as defensive installations and countermeasures. His service record included commendations for technical innovation and problem-solving under difficult conditions, capabilities that seemed inconsistent with his post-war life as a rural farmer. More disturbing were medical records that documented Herschel's exposure to experimental materials during his military service. The details were heavily redacted, but the records suggested he had suffered injuries that required ongoing medical monitoring. A note in his discharge papers recommended periodic evaluation to assess long-term effects of service-related exposures. Dr. Redfield realized that Herschel's disappearance might be connected to his wartime service rather than any local circumstances. If he had been involved in classified military projects, his sudden vanishing could represent an extraction operation, witness protection, or elimination of a security risk. The letter that prevented the property auction might have come from legitimate government sources acting to protect classified information or dangerous materials. In 1964, Dr. Redfield petitioned Newton County for permission to conduct an academic study of the property, presenting his research as part of a broader historical documentation project. His request was granted with the understanding that any discoveries would be shared with appropriate authorities and that safety protocols would be followed. The investigation began in spring 1964 with a team that included Dr. Redfield, 2 graduate students, a photographer, and a structural engineer. Their initial examination focused on the cabin's construction and any unusual features that might explain the government interest. What they found exceeded their expectations and transformed the project from academic research into something far more serious. The basement workshop was indeed more extensive than the original searches had revealed. Using architectural drawings and precise measurements, the team identified discrepancies in the foundation that suggested additional concealed spaces. Behind what appeared to be a solid stone wall, they discovered a hidden entrance that had been so expertly concealed that it was invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Beyond the hidden door lay a complex of rooms that extended far beyond the cabin's foundation. The construction was sophisticated, featuring reinforced walls, ventilation systems, and electrical wiring that seemed decades ahead of what would have been available in rural Arkansas during the 1910s. The rooms contained equipment whose purpose wasn't immediately clear but appeared related to precision manufacturing or scientific research. Most disturbing were the documents found in a sealed metal cabinet. Written in Herschel's careful handwriting, they detailed experiments and observations that suggested he had continued his wartime research in complete secrecy. The notes referenced containment procedures, atmospheric measurements, and biological responses, without providing enough context to understand their full meaning. Dates on the documents showed that this work had continued until just days before his disappearance. One document stood out for its urgent tone and clear implications. Titled Final Assessment, October 1953. Though it described the failure of containment measures and the decision to implement Protocol 7, which appeared to involve abandoning the site and relocating to a backup facility. The document warned that subjects have exceeded predicted parameters and that continued presence poses unacceptable risk to regional population. Dr. Redfield immediately suspended the investigation and contacted federal authorities. Within 48 hours, government agents arrived to secure the site and confiscate all materials related to the discovery. Dr. Redfield and his team were required to sign agreements prohibiting them from discussing their findings or publishing any results from their research. The property was then permanently sealed by order of an unnamed federal agency. New warning signs were installed, the access road was blocked, and regular patrols were established to prevent unauthorized entry. Official records indicated the property had been contaminated by hazardous materials requiring indefinite quarantine, though no details were provided about the nature of the contamination or the timeline for remediation. Dr. Redfield's academic career suffered significantly from his involvement in the investigation. His university, pressured by government officials, reassigned him to less sensitive research projects and discouraged his continued interest in the case. His planned book on Ozark communities was never completed, and his research notes were confiscated as part of the security agreement he was forced to sign. In his private journals, discovered after his death in 1982, Dr. Redfield documented his ongoing concerns about what he had found at Herschel's property, Pew. He believed the underground complex represented a continuation of classified military research that had far exceeded its original scope and purpose. His notes suggested that Herschel had been working on projects related to biological or chemical warfare, possibly developing weapons or countermeasures that had become dangerous even to their creator. The journal entries also revealed Dr. Redfield's theory about Herschel's disappearance. Rather than being eliminated as a security risk, he believed Herschel had been evacuated when his experiments became too dangerous to continue. The October 1953 conversation, witnessed by Cordelia Vance, might have been final negotiations about extraction procedures and site abandonment. The missing rifle and hunting jacket could have been props to make his departure look like a hunting accident. Most chilling was Dr. Redfield's final theory about the underground complex. His measurements and observations suggested that the facility had been designed not just for research, but for containment of something that required constant monitoring and control. The sophisticated ventilation systems, the multiple sealed rooms, the redundant security measures all pointed to a facility designed to keep something in rather than keeping people out. The documents found in the metal cabinet included references to subjects that required feeding, environmental controls, and behavioral monitoring. Without more context, it was impossible to determine whether these subjects were animals, plants, or something else entirely. But the urgency in Herschel's final notes suggested that whatever was being contained had somehow exceeded the facility's ability to control it. In 1967, 3 years after the site was officially sealed, unusual incidents began occurring in the valley around Herschel's former property. Livestock on neighboring farms developed mysterious illnesses that veterinarians couldn't diagnose or treat. Wells and springs that had provided clean water for generations became contaminated with substances that testing couldn't identify. Trees and vegetation near the property line showed signs of disease that didn't correspond to any known agricultural problems. Most disturbing were the reports from residents who lived within a few miles of the sealed property. They described changes in local wildlife behavior, with animals avoiding certain areas entirely or acting aggressively when forced to cross particular boundaries. Night sounds from the forest became different, including mechanical noises that seemed to come from underground sources and could be heard despite the facility's supposed abandonment. Cordelia Vance, now in her 80s and one of the few remaining neighbors from Herschel's time, reported the most specific incidents. She documented unusual phenomena in a diary that she kept hidden until shortly before her death in 1969. Her entries described lights visible deep underground, vibrations that could be felt through the ground during certain weather conditions, and sounds that suggested ongoing mechanical activity beneath the sealed facility. Her final entry, written just days before her death, provided a chilling perspective on the entire situation. I understand now why Herschel seemed so worried in those last weeks. He knew what he had created down there, and he knew it wasn't going to stay contained forever. The government men who took him away probably thought they could control it better than he could, but they were wrong. Some things aren't meant to be controlled by anybody. Some secrets are too dangerous to keep, but even more dangerous to let loose. Newton County officials attempted to investigate the environmental problems, but were prevented from accessing the sealed property by federal authority. State environmental agencies were similarly excluded from any examination of potential contamination sources. Residents who reported problems were advised to relocate, with the government providing financial assistance for property purchases at above-market prices. Within 2 years, the entire valley within a 5-mile radius of Herschel's former property had been evacuated and declared a restricted zone. The official explanation for the evacuation centered on environmental contamination from unknown sources, possibly related to illegal dumping or industrial activity from previous decades. No mention was made of Herschel Grimm or the research facility discovered beneath his cabin. Government statements emphasized that the contamination posed no immediate threat to public health, but required long-term monitoring and eventual remediation. Local newspapers were discouraged from extensive coverage of the evacuation, and regional media outlets showed little interest in what appeared to be a routine environmental cleanup operation. The story never gained traction beyond the immediate area, and within a few years, most people had forgotten about the mysterious contamination that had displaced an entire rural community. The restricted zone remains in effect today, though the original justifications have been largely forgotten by subsequent generations of officials. Periodic monitoring continues, conducted by contractors whose work is classified and whose reports are not made available to state or local authorities. The area has become another forgotten corner of the Arkansas Ozarks, where nature is slowly reclaiming the abandoned farms and homesteads of families who once called the valley home. But nature's reclamation has not proceeded normally. Satellite imagery shows that vegetation patterns within the restricted zone follow unusual configurations that don't correspond to natural growth or previous agricultural use. The forest appears healthy from a distance, but closer examination reveals species compositions and growth patterns that differ significantly from surrounding areas. Some plant varieties appear to be mutations or hybrids that don't exist anywhere else in the region. Wildlife populations within the zone have also developed characteristics that puzzle biologists who have studied the area from outside the restricted boundaries. Animals appear larger and more aggressive than their counterparts in neighboring areas. Migration patterns have shifted to avoid certain sections entirely, creating corridors and boundaries that persist across multiple generations and species. Most notably, no animals that enter certain core areas of the zone ever emerge, though no remains or evidence of death are ever found. The few government personnel authorized to work within the restricted zone are required to follow protocols that suggest ongoing active management rather than simple environmental monitoring. Equipment deliveries include materials typically associated with containment and control rather than research or cleanup. Work schedules follow patterns that indicate 24-hour operations, despite official statements that the area is uninhabited and inactive. Occasionally, former residents who were relocated from the valley report unusual dreams or sensations related to their old properties. These experiences typically involve underground sounds, mechanical vibrations, or the sense that something beneath the earth continues to grow and change. While these reports are easily dismissed as psychological responses to displacement and loss, their consistency across multiple individuals and their persistence over decades suggest something beyond normal adjustment difficulties. The legacy of Herschel Grimm has become a cautionary tale about the unintended consequences of secrecy and isolation. Whatever research he conducted in his underground laboratory, whatever secrets he brought back from his military service, whatever he created or discovered in the depths beneath his Arkansas cabin, the results have proven too dangerous to eliminate and too important to ignore. The solution has been containment and concealment, maintaining a dangerous secret through bureaucratic mechanisms that outlive the people who understand its true nature. In the files of the federal agency responsible for monitoring the restricted zone, Herschel's case is designated as indefinite containment pending technological solution. The phrase suggests that whatever lies beneath his former property represents a problem for which current science and engineering have no answer. Each generation of officials inherits responsibility for maintaining security around a threat they don't fully understand, waiting for future capabilities that may never develop. The residents of the Arkansas Ozarks have long memories and persistent curiosity. Stories about the sealed valley, the evacuated families, and the mysterious neighbor who vanished on an autumn night continue to circulate in the form of whispered rumors and half-remembered warnings. Children are taught to avoid certain roads and forest paths without being told exactly why. Hunters learn to respect invisible boundaries that keep them away from areas that officially don't exist. And sometimes on quiet nights when the wind carries sounds from unexpected directions, people claim they can still hear the mechanical rhythm that once emerged from Herschel's underground workshop. The sound of something that continues to run, continues to operate, continues to grow beneath the earth, waiting patiently for its containment to fail, or for someone to decide that the secret has been kept long enough. Herschel Grimm wanted only to live quietly, to use his skills helping his neighbors, to keep his wartime experiences buried beneath the routine of rural life. But some knowledge cannot be discarded, some skills cannot be abandoned, and some secrets cannot be kept forever. In trying to contain what he had learned and created, he became part of something larger and more dangerous than anything he could have imagined. The neighbor everyone trusted disappeared on the night he didn't answer his door, but what he left behind continues to answer questions that no one wants to ask. In the depths of the Arkansas earth, beneath layers of secrecy and bureaucratic concealment, something waits that embodies the true cost of knowledge pursued without wisdom, power developed without restraint, and secrets kept too long in the darkness. The restricted zone expands by a few acres each year, following patterns that suggest internal pressure rather than external contamination. The problem that Herschel Grimm tried to solve in 1953 remains unsolved, growing stronger with each passing decade, patiently testing the boundaries that contain it. Whatever protocol he implemented, when he decided to abandon his life and disappear into government protection, it was designed as a temporary measure until a permanent solution could be developed. That solution has never materialized, and the temporary measures have become the only thing standing between a rural Arkansas valley and consequences that extend far beyond what anyone in 1953 could have comprehended. The files remain classified, the zone remains restricted, and the questions remain unanswered. But the Arkansas Ozarks remember in the way that old places remember, through stories and silences, through changed migration patterns and altered growth cycles, through the persistent sense that something beneath the earth continues its patient work, waiting for the moment when containment inevitably fails and secrets can no longer be kept.